Today, Ravens, we're going to think about how a plot of a story usually goes and how it kind of unfolds in a series of episodes. Right now you're watching this video and you're going to color code this anchor chart. We're going to add some notes to it, then you're going to paste it into your notebook. After that, you're going to use this plot diagram to plot out the plot of a story that we've already read. So this is called the plot diagram. Sometimes it's called the narrative trajectory. And what it is, it's showing us a predictable pattern that many stories have. You often read a story and you know how it's going to go. And it's because it's following this predictable pattern. There are other predictable patterns like the hero's journey, which is more of a circular design, and we'll learn about that later. But today we're going to look about, we're going to use this story mountain to talk about how stories usually go. And first of all, stories are centered around a conflict. In the center of this is a conflict, and this black line represents how the conflict changes over the story. First, there's no conflict. Then something happens, and the conflict grows and grows and grows to the point where it turns around and starts to get better and resolved. And then at the end, the problem's pretty much over. So each of these stages of the conflict's journey has a name. The first name is called the exposition. In the exposition, there really isn't a conflict. They might just be kind of setting it up. In the exposition, we learn where the story takes place, who the main characters are, and what's happened maybe in the past that might set the character up for the problem that's going to take place in this story. There's some vocabulary down here. By the end, we should have gotten all of these words on our chart. So we've got conflict and we've got exposition. I'm going to color code the exposition yellow, like this. And all of this is part of the exposition. Okay, so our character's maybe had 13 years in his life, and he's maybe set up for this particular problem, but nothing's actually happened in our story yet. And then something happens that gets the story going, and that's called the inciting action. I'm going to write the inciting action on that line. And it's pointing to that exact turning point in our diagram. I'm going to color that pink too. If you need to stop the video to do each of these steps, just pause it and continue when you're ready. Okay. So we have the background of the character, and then something happens to get the story started. That's the inciting action. After that, we have the rising action. Rising action. And often we have lots of events. The rising action is usually the biggest part of the story. This happens, and then this happens, and something else happens, and it gets worse, and it gets more complicated, and more events happen until we reach the climax. Let's still fill in our rising action. We're going to make that orange. Okay, and this is the events that create tension and make the conflict more complicated. Okay? Then there's the climax of the story. The climax is the tippy top of the mountain. And the climax, some people think the climax is the most exciting part of the story. It might be the most exciting part of the story, but that's not what makes it the climax. What makes it the climax is it's the turning point. It's the point where that conflict goes from getting worse and worse to starting to get better. Something happens. The climax is usually a very short part of the story. It might be a sentence or two or a paragraph. It's a very precise point where something big happens to turn the conflict around. All right, after that, things start to fall into place. And that's why we call this the falling action. Things are headed towards a resolution. The conflict is going to get better. The events that need to take place to make the resolution occur do. And finally, the conflict is resolved. It's over. That doesn't mean everything is completely solved or fixed. For example, in our story Rebound, Charlie is struggling with the grief over losing his father. And we know that by the end of the story, his father's not going to be undead, right? But he will still have the grief that he's struggling with all the time. But maybe he'll have figured out a way to live with it and to move on. So it's at least resolved. And so we've done resolution, we've done falling action,